We're going to look at how to use CSS filters and CSS mixed blend modes to achieve some interesting visual effects with our images and text and whatnot, just using CSS. So CSS filters work very similarly to what you might think of in Photoshop or something like that, and the same is true of mixed blend modes. So before we get into the actual CSS, let's just look at this pretty basic HTML that we have set up here. I have an outer div with a class of wrapper, we have an image tag, and then there is an empty div with a class of overlay, which we will revisit that when we start looking at mixed blend modes. But for now, let's look at filters and see what effect they can give us on just a straight up image. So you'll notice here I have a bunch of CSS that I have commented out. That's so I can kind of sequentially step through and show you how each of these things work. So let's walk through the different filters that we have available to us and see what effect they have in manipulating our image. So the first one we'll look at is blur. Now the blur filter does exactly what you would expect. It blurs it by a certain amount. So you can give this really any unit of measurement. You can give it a pixel value, you can give it a percentage, you can give it actually that's not true, you just give it a pixel value, sorry about that. Okay, so we can give it a small pixel value for a little bit of blur, you can give it a large pixel value for like a ridiculous amount of blur, and this can come in handy for a lot of different things. You could have like a slightly blurred image that comes into focus on hover, for example. Like you could imagine doing that in a photo gallery or something like that. There are use cases where you can use progressive loading of images, like what I'm about to show you here, to load a low resolution image first, and then when the full resolution image becomes available, to kind of take that blur off the low resolution and swap it out with a clean resolution one. That can be good for performance. So that's blur. Let's keep stepping down the list here. So next up we have brightness. And brightness will basically amplify the existing brightness of a photograph by whatever number you give it. So 5 times brightness obviously is much, much brighter. Brightness amplified by 1 is basically the exact same thing, but you can do decimals here. If we wanted to just bump it up a little bit, like 1.1. So brightness takes a single number without any unit of measurement applied to it. Next we have contrast. Contrast will apply as much contrast as you provide to the value, and this takes a percentage. So we could bump up the contrast by 200%, and you'll see what effect that has. We could bump it up by 500%, you'll see what effect that has. We could be a little bit more subtle and just do 120%. So basically, this is just like using contrast filters if you were developing in the darkroom, or if you were trying to apply the contrast slider in either Photoshop or Lightroom. So that's contrast. Next we have drop shadow. Drop shadow works fairly similarly to box shadow, but it comes in a little bit more handy when you're using things that are not like square. When you could do this with like something you made with the CSS shape, for example, and that drop shadow would conform to the shape. We also have grayscale, which is basically going to just convert your color photograph to grayscale if you set it to 100%, or just sort of subtly set it to gray, a little bit more gray version of itself if you have anything less than 100%. So you could imagine using this in a photo gallery where your thumbnails are black and white, and then you hover on them and they come into color. We have hue rotate, which is going to take the colors on the color wheel and basically find every color point on that color wheel and give you the opposing side of it on the color wheel. We have invert, which is going to just give you a negative of your image. We have opacity, which, as the name implies, changes the opacity. So if you had something behind this, you could you could see it through that image. We have saturate, which is going to bump up the saturation of all the colors by whatever percentage you provide to that saturate. So we can say 200%, and it's going to be twice as saturated as it was initially. Again, you can take this as far or as restrained as you want. We have sepia, which is going to give a sepia-esque quality to your image, so it gives it a little browning. And then lastly, we can combine filters. So here we see increasing the contrast and increasing the brightness. I always need to look up whether or not they're comma separated or not. Sometimes the effect is good, sometimes the effect is not, but it's something that you can do. Okay, so one thing I want to show you with Firefox is in your developer tools, if you right click, select inspect element, and then make sure that you have the image that you want, that you have the filter applied to highlighted. Firefox has a built-in filter tool to help you kind of have a visual output of what the filters will do, and to allow you to kind of combine different filters for different effects. So if we click on that, currently we don't have a specified filter, but let's just say I wanted to use the hue rotate one. So I could click on that, and then if I start changing these values, then I start to see that change being applied in my image. You can kind of see that that's a little different. Let's make this like a really radical change, so it's a little bit more evident. So you can see it start to get green there. Okay, so now we've got that. Now maybe I want to add some contrast to this. So I'll select the contrast from the drop-down menu here. I'll hit the plus, and then we'll start bumping up that contrast. And you can kind of see the image start to come back in. So you can just kind of keep cranking this up until you get it to a point where you like it. So let's say 150. Let's just get it to the point where we can actually see it. So we'll move it up to like 50% or something like that. Okay, so now we have that contrast is applied. It's a little bit less contrast than we had before. So now maybe we want to, I don't know, increase the saturation here. So we can select the drop-down saturate, click the plus to add it, and then it starts at the lowest possible value, and then you use these little arrows to crank it up. So now as we start to get into higher numbers, we start to see those color saturations come back. And I want to get this over 100% so we can actually see the effect of having increased the saturation on here. All right, here we go. So now you can kind of see those colors start to saturate just a little bit more than they were. So let's go all the way up to 150 or so. And there we go. So now I have the hue rotate filter applied with 79-degree rotation on the color wheel. We have the contrast bumped down to 52.3%, and we have the saturation bumped up to 150%. Now let's say I like the way this looks. I don't necessarily, but let's say I like it. I could save this as a preset, so then later I could come in and apply that preset to any other image that I want to. So I'm going to name this bad preset because it's ugly. Click the plus button, and now I have this available to me. Anytime I have an image that has a filter on it, I can automatically have this available to apply to any image I want to. So that's a really cool feature within Firefox, is this built-in filter editor. And you'll see that I mentioned before I didn't know if the combining filters was supposed to be comma separated or not. They are not. If you have multiple filters on an image, you do not comma separate them. There's just a space between one after the other. And I will say that the order in which you do this will make a difference in terms of how it looks. So an image that has had the hue rotate filter applied to it before the contrast is applied to it will look different than an image that has had the contrast filter applied to it before the hue rotate. So just keep that in mind. And as always with Firefox, I have the changes that I've made in my filter editor here in the Changes tab of the Developer Tools. So if I like this, I can come over here and I can click Copy Rule, and then I can come back over and paste that into my CSS. Okay, so we're going to close that, and then let's save this and reload, and we'll just kind of put, let's put a contrast filter on here, and we'll just leave it for now. Actually, instead, before we do that, let's go over Mix Blend Mode. So Mix Blend Mode is a CSS property that allows you to kind of dictate how the overlapping elements kind of blend into each other. So the way that their color values sort of interpolate between each other. So that's kind of a theoretical sounding bit of jargon. So let's see what it looks like in practice. So just as a reminder, we have this empty div with the class of overlay in our HTML here. And then in the CSS, I have just, right now I had it set to display none simply because I didn't want to get in the way while we were talking about filters. But I'm going to turn that off now. And you'll see here that I have it set to position absolute. And the reason that I'm doing that is to just have it lying on top of this image. So we've got this semi-transparent blue background here. It's 50% wide and 100% tall of the container, and you can see the image peeking out from behind it. So the reason that I have it set up with a small amount of transparency is just so we can see the difference as we go through these mixed blend modes. So first up, and you'll notice these values map very closely to values of blend modes in Photoshop. So the first value is normal, and effectively that's the same as doing nothing. The only reason that you would use normal is if you had mixed blend mode set to one of the other values and you wanted to transition back to the normal value on like a hover state or something along those lines. Next up we have multiply, and multiply will give I'm not really great at explaining exactly what's going on here, but this is the visual output of multiply. It'll kind of multiply the color stop values of the overlaying element with the color stop values of the underlying element. So I'm just going to step through these different values and show you what the output is. So that was multiply. We also have screen. So again, just like a subtle blending of those two elements. We have overlay. Looks fairly similar to screen, but this would be different depending on what specific content you are working with. We have darken. We have lighten. We have color dodge. And we have color burn. We have hard light. We have soft light. We're pretty subtle there. We have difference, which is going to be like the actual color differences between the two, kind of turns into a little bit of a negative. We have exclusion. We have hue. Saturation. Color. And finally, luminosity. So by combining these, so I'm going to go back, I'm going to turn on soft light, and we'll turn on saturate for the filter. So by combining mixed blend modes and filters, you can really start to do some very interesting things with your images purely through CSS. So a lot of the things that you're used to doing in Photoshop, you can just load up your images and then use CSS to do a lot of that manipulation for you, which is really very cool. So before wrapping this up, right now I just have a basic light blue background here. You can also do really interesting things with using gradients to make stripes. So here you can see that I've got the striped background set on my overlay, and the way that I'm doing that is with a value called repeating linear gradient. And this is basically saying this is the degree that I want this linear gradient to occupy. So you can see it's at a 45-degree angle. This is the first color stop, and then we want that to go for 50 pixels. This is the second color stop. We want that to go for 50 pixels, and the same for the final color stop, only 100 pixels. So we've got these cool stripes here. And then when we start to combine that with our mixed blend modes, we can really start to do some cool stuff. So all kinds of cool things going on in there. I'm going to set this to color. Now I've got some different gradients going on here, so let's just see what some of those would look like. So if I were to comment this out and then add a new value in here, then you start to see how this like 45-degree red to blue gradient starts to have an effect over the image. Let me just bump this over a little bit so you can see on the other part of the image. So pretty cool stuff there. So yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do with filters and mixed blend modes, and this should help with the poster project that is the next assignment for Web 2. So before we move on, I want to show you just a couple things that I have done with mixed blend mode, just to kind of show how it can be used for artistic purposes. Oh, sorry. I'm going to go back to my dashboard here. Okay, so let's go to pens. I'm just going to dig through. So this one looks pretty cool in Chrome. So let me open up Chrome here. Okay, here we go. So this is using a backdrop filter, which is similar to filter, and it's kind of overlaid over this image, so it's only blurring half of it, which is pretty neat. And it doesn't work that same way in Firefox, so it is picking up just a straight up blur. So that's one example. Let's find a couple other ones. Here we go. So with this one, all I have here is a div, again, div of the class of wrapper. Then we've got a div in there with the class of text, and all that has in it is this h1, and then we have this image. So those are the only two elements in there. And then we have set up a one column, one row grid on the wrapper. And then we've set the text to occupy that entire space. So that's where that h1 comes in. We've set a z-index of 5 to make sure that it sits on top. And then we've set this background to also occupy the whole grid and to make sure that it has a minimum height of 100 VH. So by changing the mixed blend modes on the text, we can kind of affect the way that this looks. So we could say multiply and we'll get something different. We could say color, text goes away. We could say color burn. We get, again, something different. Dodge. So some of these will work for your purposes. Some of them will not. It depends on what the content is, whether you're using text or just colors and images. But I think you can do some really interesting visual stuff using mixed blend mode. So let's go back to one more example. Actually, I think I could just go to my profile. I have this one pinned. Yeah, so here we've got an image, some text is hanging off of it, and then using mixed blend mode for that text, where the text is overlaying the image, it's taking the values in the image and sort of interpolating them with the color values of the text. And then over here, where it's just going over black, that's not happening. There's no mixed blend mode happening there. So that's filters and mixed blend modes. A lot of cool stuff you can do with it, and I look forward to seeing what you do. Up on filters that I didn't cover in the first part of the video, both in terms of the filter tool within Firefox and in things that you can do with the filters. So filters are a property that you can animate. So that means that you can add a transition to a filter so that when you're transitioning from one value of a filter to another value, that can kind of move seamlessly rather than being a jump cut like this. If I were to hover over this, rather than snapping from gray to colored, I can transition that. So the first thing that you need to do to make that happen is on the base image or the base element itself that has the filter, you use the transition property. You say the property that you want to animate, in this case it's filter, and then the only other thing you absolutely need is the amount of time that you want that transition to take. You could also add a transition timing function. You could also add a transition delay if you wanted to. But for our purposes, we're just going to say we want to animate the filter and we want it to take half a second. So then we've got our base filter applied. We've got a filter of grayscale. And then in our hover pseudo selector, we use the filter property, and then we change to a different value. So we'll say grayscale because that's the filter that we're using, and we'll just say 0%. So we're going to be transitioning from filter grayscale 100% to filter grayscale 0%. And now, when I hover over it, thing is you actually have to spell grayscale properly, so G-R-A-Y. Now when I hover over it, it kind of fades in nicely from gray to colored. So that's pretty cool. Again, you can imagine this as like a thumbnail in a photo gallery. You hover over the thumbnail and it comes up to full color. Okay, so let's look at the filter tool one more time. I'm going to say inspect element and pull these up so we can see them. So I've got my filter here because we've got hover turned on. Let's turn that off for now. Anyway, that doesn't really matter. Let's just look at the tool. So we'll click on this circle to open up our filter. And then we've already got grayscale here at 0. So let's say that we wanted to add another filter. So we'll add brightness or something like that. We apply that. It's currently set at 0. So if we say, I don't quite know why you have to use the up arrows to do this, and it only works in like single digits, but there we are. So I'm just going to turn this up quite a bit, or at least get it back to the point where we're above 100% and it's actually adding some brightness. So I mentioned when we were talking about filters initially that the order of the filters matters, that it can have an effect. If you apply grayscale before you add brightness or brightness before grayscale, you can come up with different visual aesthetics. So let's just look at how we could preview that in developer tools. So imagine you're getting together like a collection of different filters together that you want to see how how they jive with each other and what your visual output is. So you've opened up your filter tool here in Firefox, and you've got a couple selected, and you've got some values dialed in here that you like. Um, kind of see it's starting to get a little bit more black and white here. Color's going away a little bit. Okay, so let's leave it here. So there's a couple different ways that you can see how the order matters. Like, first of all, you could take this and drag it down beneath the other one. And in this particular example, nothing really changes. But if you had a bunch of different filters here, it might. You can also, that's basically it, is you can drag and drop them into different orders. And then again, if we wanted to set up this preset, you can see that preset that I had from before. If we wanted to use that, we could click on that and it would apply the preset. So that's nice too. So again, here we could move these around and see if it matters, see if there's any effect in changing the order of these. And in this example, it doesn't really look like there is. But again, it's nice to be able to have that option to do the visual output and know exactly what to expect.